Introduce our first guest speaker, Professor Femi Oyebode. Okay. Is a retired professor and head of Department of Psychiatry at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He has investigated the relationships between literature and psychiatry. His research has considered descriptive psychopathology and delusional misidentification syndrome. He was awarded the 2016 Royal College of Psychiatrists Lifetime Achievement Award. He studied medicine at the University of Ibadan and moved to Newcastle in 1979. In 1983, he was appointed a consultant psychiatry in the University Hospitals, Birmingham, in the UK. Alongside his research career, Professor Oyebode is interested in the intersection of psychiatry and literature. He has written about the need for humanities in postgraduate medical education and has published over seven volumes of poetry. He is the recipient of several awards, including the Legend recognition at the Creative and Arts Awards in 2017. Some of his publications include Poverty, Social Inequality, and Mental Health, and also Misreading Literature and Psychiatry. It's a pleasure to have Professor Oyebode here, and we look forward to learning from him, engaging with him. Welcome, Professor, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction and your kind invitation as well. I want to thank Augustine for persevering and then to find a topic that he would ask me to speak about, which would also resonate with a subject matter which there are African scholars already involved in that subject area. So I'm going to be speaking about medical humanities, and I'm going to leave the African literature aspect of it to my Nigerian colleagues who have written about that subject. So I'm going to talk in very general terms about medical humanities. And I suppose a good way to start is to ask oneself, what have the humanities got to do with medicine? And a good entry point into that question is to remind oneself that that medicine essentially is an applied science, and being an applied science, there's a kind of preoccupation, if you wish, a privileging of objectivity in medicine, because there's this notion that the subjective is prone to bias, that the subjective is much more likely to be prone to error, and therefore objectivity, the kind of notions of proxy markers, and the idea that physics is the most highest of all the sciences, and that the rest of the sciences has to try to be as close to the parameters, the paradigms that the physicists use. So there's a total kind of privileging of the objective in medicine. And of course, there's the risk that when you privilege the objective in medicine, the loss is that you lose what is human in medicine, that you lose the subjective in medicine. And so it's not, my task today is not to talk about what the nature of the subjective is and what do we mean by terms like intersubjectivity and how we distinguish them from objectivity and so on, just to make the point that there is this distinction to be made between what is objective and what is subjective. And that in medicine, the risk is that when you are preoccupied with the objective, then you forget that the diseases are diseases which afflict humans, that afflict persons. And one of the real risks is that you become callous, that you have this kind of detachment, that you become alienated from the person who is suffering. And therefore, the attempt to re-engage the humane in medicine has come through the notion that maybe the humanities has got something to offer, that maybe the humanities can refresh medicine, that may be taking a humane perspective, the humanities perspective, which of course privileges the subjective, that maybe that might be helpful to medicine. Because, well, and it's not my subject today, but of course that too has its own risks. So one of the risks of privileging the subjective, of course, is the risk of what in psychiatry we might call enmeshment, that the idea that you become so entangled with the personal of the patient that you're not able to make proper decisions. And there's also this risk of what is now become very topical, this idea of a moral injury, the idea that if you become, that you can be overwhelmed, that you can suffer from compassion fatigue, if you want to put it like that. So we're not, I'm certainly not wanting to valorize the subjective or the humanities over the sciences. My task today is just to say that there are benefits that could accrue to medicine if we were to take on board the humanities project. Now, so what I've just done there is just to say a little bit about what the context is of the development of the medical humanities. And of course, the medical humanities involves much more than literature. I'm just a person who's preoccupied with literature. Medical humanities includes medical history, the history of medicine, for example, and also includes medical ethics, the application of moral philosophy to clinical encounters and clinical practice. But my preoccupation for today's purposes anyway is the medical humanities vis-a-vis what literature has to offer us. And so the question, of course, is that what are the goals of the study of literature in medicine? And broadly speaking, what I've done is I've just taken Rita Charon's work and I've just itemized some of what she has to say. And then I'm going to try and populate these headings as we go on. So she has 5 goals, 5 purposes of literature in medicine. She talks about the literary accounts of illness can teach doctors lessons about the lives of sick people, that fiction allows physicians to see the power implications of what they do. In other words, that doctors themselves benefit from being objectified in literature and fiction, so they see how ordinary people take them. Thirdly, that the narrative structure, the way in which humans like telling stories, the way stories are told, that itself is important. So if we come to understand the nature of storytelling, because as you all know, humans are storytelling animals, and therefore, if we understand that allows us to listen more attentively, helps us to be able to make sense of what people are saying, because of course human beings, as you all know, don't always say what they think, that they have all sorts of devices and methods of speaking, and all sorts of self-deception and omissions and so on. And so there's this idea that a bit more understanding and awareness of the nature of narrative structure is helpful in the clinical encounter. And fourthly, because of the degree to which medical ethics, the application of moral philosophy, is important in contemporary medicine, that we can use what Rita Charon calls narrative ethics, by which she means the ways in which a story, which is a fictional account or a myth, can stand for real cases, so that it helps us to be able to understand what are the important principles which underlie clinical practice. And finally, she talks about a literary theory and how that offers or may offer new perspectives in medicine. So I've just very quickly, in a schematic way, said something about what the potential benefits of the humanities literature in particular might be to medicine. So if I then take each in turn and just expand on that a little. And so we start off with this idea that literary representations of the physician's work, patients, descriptions of patients' lives, helps us to understand what sick people think about and what they worry about, tells us a little bit more about how diseases may limit people's lives, or helps us understand the attributions by which we mean the meanings that people give to their experiences. And therefore, and of course, as you know, literature deals with some of the most important matters in human life, deals with matters of death, and deals with matters of love, and so on. And therefore, the ways in which literary accounts tell us something about the nature of mortality, tells us something about how humans respond if they were to have a disease that's going to kill them. That helps, informs a person who works in a clinical setting so that he's much more aware of what it is that the patient in front of him might be worrying about and might be anxious about, and so on. So of course, I'm a psychiatrist, and I want to make this point at the outset that that medical humanities aren't only interesting for psychiatrists. So if you've got a motor neuron disease, which is a condition which ultimately kills you, but before it kills you, it paralyzes you, and to the degree that you can hardly move, you can't move any of your limbs, and it paralyzes your diaphragm, which means you have difficulty breathing, and it paralyzes your ability to speak. And so if you've got motor neuron disease, it's important to see whether we've got people who've given personal accounts of what that's like, because it's an unimaginable life to be living. Therefore, personal accounts are very, very helpful in that sort of setting. Well, of course, psychiatry is different from the rest of medicine, because one of the things I've said at the outset is this distinction that's to be made between the subjective and the objective. So, and psychiatry, of course, unlike all other specialties in medicine, where if something's wrong with your bones don't affect your personhood. Therefore, yourself, your sense of self, is unaffected by the disease that you're suffering from. Whereas in psychiatry, the diseases themselves are expressed through personhood. So they're expressed through the things that make us human in particular. So they're expressed through our capacity to think, they're expressed through our capacity to use language, they're expressed through our ability to reenact reality, and I use that word to mean things like the ability to hear things which are really being said, rather than hearing things which are being imagined, or things which are not there, and so on and so forth. So in psychiatry, therefore, it is even much more acutely important to be able to understand the ways in which I think somebody else has got their mic on, so they might want to mute it. So you want to mute your mic, I think. So the way the patients experience their lives, and in that respect, the subjective accounts rather than fictional accounts, autobiographical accounts and memoirs are probably far much more interesting and far much more valuable than fictional accounts. And then this idea of the doctor's life, that the literal representation of the physician's work helps to clarify the many roles and expectations of medicine. And of course, in order to do this work that we do, in order to do it properly, one of the things you have to do is you've got to come into the clinical encounter with humility. Therefore, the best people somehow have not to properly understand the degree of power they have or influence they have on people's lives, because in order to be too aware of it, it can be very damaging and very just disruptive. Therefore, the accounts, fictional accounts or personal accounts by doctors of what their life is like, is helpful for other clinicians in order to understand properly what it is like to do this work that we do. And I hinted already at this idea of moral injury, this idea that objectivity, which is the capacity as a 23-year-old who is working in an accident and emergency, who is suddenly confronted by a person who's been involved in a car crash, who is about the same age and who is bleeding profusely and who's likely to die. So in order to do that work, there's a degree to which you have to be cold, because if your emotions are involved, then it makes it very, very hard to do that work. But the same is also true that if you're not aware of the importance of saving that life, if you are not aware of the fact that that person is somebody's child, and if you're not aware of the fact that their dying would have an adverse impact on the lives of so many other people, their parents and their siblings, then the extraordinary mission to save a life might be lost. So the point I'm trying to make there is that accounts of these kinds allows us to be able to do the work properly, but also too much involvement may make it difficult to do the work as well as we ought to do them. So there's a balance to be struck. And of course, we in psychiatry, we will talk a little bit about writers like Sylvia Plath, who is an American poet who you all know, wrote a wonderful novel, Bell Jar, which is an autobiographical novel. And then, of course, we got her poetry, which also tells us a little bit about her life. But in her books, she talks about the people who care for her. So that itself is useful to read in order to see how she feels about the care that they've given for her, and so on. And then you got the business of narrative ethics, which I talked about earlier, that this is the ability to be sensitive to the moral questions which we deal with in our trade. So the whole idea of the 5 principles, the whole idea of autonomy, which of course informed consent flows naturally out of the idea of the autonomy of the individual, and the whole idea of beneficence, the idea that your actions ought to try to do good, at least not to do harm. So the idea of non-maleficence, and then the whole idea of paternalism, the idea that the fact that somebody is making the wrong choice, and the fact that the choice they've made might result in their death, but nonetheless doesn't mean that you ought to stop them for as long as it's a conscientious choice. So all these very pregnant, very, very keen questions which arise within the clinical encounter, they are sometimes very, very difficult to tackle in using the case examples. And the point that Rita Charon makes is that they are sometimes easier to tackle. And of course, we are at the present moment going through a pandemic. And in order to understand the doctor's duty, for example, in the context of a pandemic, what better novel to read than Camus' La Peste, Camus' The Plague, where he explores where the central character, of course, is the pest, is the plague itself, but the second most important character in the novel is the doctor. And it allows us to explore what is the doctor's duty in the context of a plague, in the context of the Ebola virus, for example. How do you choose to work in the context in which you might yourself catch something that might kill you? Not only is it that you might catch something that might kill you, but if you're staying with your relatives in multi-generation households and your relatives are vulnerable because they have morbidity, do you take it back home to them? And how do you determine whether you should go and stay in a hotel for 6 months, which a lot of doctors in the United Kingdom did in 2020? So a novel like Camus' The Plague allows us to think about these matters in a kind of detached way, and of course that's quite important too. And finally, to talk a little bit about literary theory and medicine. So one of the most clear distinctions between medicine and the sciences and the arts is this idea that in the sciences, there's this idea that language is neutral, that there's no persuasive communication taking place, that when in the days when I was a trainee and I was a houseman in Ibadan, and you assisted somebody in surgery and you wrote the post-surgical notes. The post-surgical notes are written as if you were just finished a physics experiment or a chemistry experiment. So they're written in the third person, and they're written as if they're only factual accounts. And when the senior people teach you, they teach you about how you do a herniorrhaphy or how you take out an appendix, as if it's neutral use of language to tell you the steps that you take. And whereas in the humanities, it is accepted that these are matters of opinion. It is accepted that these are matters of perspective. It's accepted that my interpretation of Camus' novel, even though it might be informed, but it is not God-given. Therefore, if somebody else has a different interpretation of it, we're not about to say they're in the wrong. Whereas when the chap tells you how you do an appendectomy, he implies that he's not persuading you that the way he does it is the best way. He writes and speaks about it as if it's neutral. So the benefit for us, those of us in clinical practice of the humanities, it allows you to understand that every time persuasive communication is taking place, that everybody has a perspective, that there are no neutral, independent opinions, that these opinions, that they are opinions, and therefore they can be challenged. And therefore, the notion of authority, which you have in medicine, the idea that I'm very, very experienced, so when I tell you what you ought to do, that is what you ought to do. Whereas in the humanities, it's accepted that you're just a person given an opinion. You may be very clever, but it doesn't mean that your opinion somehow is it means that your opinion isn't not open to scrutiny. So that idea of literary theory and its contributions to the sciences is very important. And I then want to say one or two things to draw it to a close, which also still speaks to this idea of literary theory. So for example, the idea of metaphor, which my colleagues in the humanities, especially in literature, the fellows who are linguists, are totally preoccupied with the nature of language and how we speak. So for example, you will know that during this pandemic, I'm sorry, I no longer, I haven't lived in Nigeria for over 40 years, but if I use my experience of living in the UK and during this pandemic, there's a lot of language of battles. And therefore, we're going to fight against it, that sort of stuff. And people use that sort of language too in when they have cancers, and there's an idea that he's not going to, he's not going to win, that sort of stuff. So, and they forget that that is a metaphorical use of language. And the reason why that's important is that the metaphors that people use matters. They matter because that metaphor sometimes is like a prison. Therefore, when you listen to the metaphor that someone's using, and sometimes people use a victim metaphor, and you might want to change a victim metaphor to help the person to feel that they're more like an agent. Therefore, you might want to say to them that they're stoical rather than they're submissive and accepting and so on. So understanding how metaphor is used in language, which our colleagues in English language literature are very, very, very much more aware of than we are, is helpful to us. And then finally, the idea, so if you, and here I speak again as a psychiatrist for a minute. So if you think of psychiatry, that the idea that somebody who is mentally ill, somebody who is unwell, that they have the semiotics of being ill, by which I mean the symbolic signals that you express to the world to let them know that you're in distress. So there's a question of where does the semiotics come from? So for example, if you were to look at theater, if you were to look at Shakespeare, for example, or you look at the great Greek tragedians, for example, and then you see that the behaviors that they are using are also the same behaviors that our patients use. So there's a theoretical question to be asked about the semiotics of illness. Where do they come from? Are they coming from theater? Are they coming from literature? Or are the writers observing it in people who are unwell and then representing it? So is it just mere mirroring? Or is there something much more important, much more interesting going on, which is to do with how things go and they become a cycle, and therefore they intensify because there's a feedback going on. So it's a human being behaves in a particular way, a writer observes how they behave and writes about it, and then the human being reads it, and then when he's distressed, he uses it, a code, to express his distress. And then, of course, because it's feedback loop, then it gets more accentuated over time and so on. And so those aspects of the nature of semiotics can come through the theater or through fiction back into real human life. And so just to convince you, if you're a little bit, a bit surprised, so if you look at something very simple, like something very, very simple, like mourning, grieving. So the expression of grief, of course, are context dependent. So if you're grieving in the UK, there's no tearing your hair out, and there's no rushing around, and there's no taking ashes and putting it over yourself or anything of that sort. So it's all very, very regulated, even though you might be wearing black. Whereas there are other cultures where, in order to express the degree to which the depth of sadness, you may then have to throw yourself about and lie on the ground. And one of the interesting things, of course, is some of the people who are doing it are themselves not the relatives of the people who've died. So I just use that to say something about the semiotics of inner life. The projections and expressions of inner life are context dependent, but they're also not just context dependent. They leak through into literature. They definitely leak through into theater, and they also, in modern society, leak through into cinema. And if they leak through into those, they then feed back into normal behaviors and so on. So to summarize, I think I've come to my time. Just to summarize, what I hope I've done is to say something about how important the medical humanities are, how extraordinary they are in helping to clarify the ways in which people behave, the inner life, inner experience of people when they're ill, and that the medical humanities has a plethora of ways in which it might assist, because the whole point of this is not theoretical in my book. The whole point of this is the degree to which it influences practice for the better. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Oyebode, and thank you all to the audience for being here. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, the moderator, Dr. Freder, to give us a brief recap of the first presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Oyebode. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I think you argued for the point that humanities should be more involved in the medical sciences. Most of all, because the humanities will allow the medical sciences to give a proper picture, a better, a more detailed, a more rich picture of the vagueness, volatility, and fluidity of the human life, as it is currently possible within the Western paradigm of objective or neutral or, in a way, non-humanized language. You make the point that this is necessary because human beings have to be considered to be storytelling animals. A very fair point, I think, an indisputable point. And this, according to your presentation, is especially important in the psychiatry, because the psychiatry, as you pointed out, is usually concerned with these kinds of diseases that will affect the sense of ourself. And when the sense of ourself is affected, we are affected in the way we perceive ourselves, and thus we're affected in the way we tell our very own stories. And so it might be of importance to take that into account, that psychiatric diseases could be understood as diseases that will affect the way that we tell our very own story. And that is something that can not be properly described by the language that the medical sciences will allow us to have. The benefit of introducing humanities, like you have described it, into the medical sciences, is that it will allow us to understand and to appreciate that we do not necessarily have to end up at at a neutral standpoint or at an objective assessment of something. But humanities seem to allow us, you gave the example of the interpretation of literary art, literary works, that there might be a little more leeway and that the truth is not necessarily this one particular spot for everyone at the same time, but there is probably a multidimensionality or a multi-perspectivism that has to be accepted. And that in the end shows the importance of medical humanities, because it will allow us to clarify the way that people live their lives and the way that they self-understand themselves when they are in that particular situation that we address as being sick or being ill. And thus it will allow us to have a different impact and maybe a more richer impact, a more appropriate impact on those people who suffer from a certain pathology, regardless what kind of pathology that is, when we take into account that there's a very specific way that we live our lives and that way we live our lives is influenced by the way we talk about ourselves. So in other words, it seems that the claim is made for the fact that we have to understand that when we try to describe the human being and when we describe the human being, when that particular being is ill, we have to understand that we need a more fluid, a more open language that especially the Western paradigms of medical sciences seem to allow us to have. So thank you very much. I hope that in a way was an appropriate reconstruction of the very many points you have made. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Augustine.
Okay,